Rome, the empire that conquered nearly the entire known world, saw its powerful war machine thwarted by an unlikely leader. Viriato, a Lusitanian warrior, challenged the Roman legions with tactics that the imperial army had never faced before. How did he manage to win battles in terrains where Roman strength and discipline faltered? Today, we will uncover the guerrilla strategies that turned Viriato into a legend, showing how he frustrated Rome and forced the empire to rethink its conquests. The story behind this leader will change your perspective on what truly defines success on the battlefield. In the vast and rugged Iberian Peninsula, Viriato emerged as an unexpected legend. Hailing from the Lusitanian mountains, he was not a general trained in the schools of war, but rather a shepherd, intimately familiar with every valley, every trail, and every natural hideout in his territory. Seeing his people threatened by the Roman invasion, Viriato rose as a leader, initially for survival, but quickly as a strategist capable of understanding and exploiting the weaknesses of an empire that, until then, seemed unstoppable. The Romans had no idea they were about to face an enemy that would force them to rethink all their combat tactics. The power of Rome lay in its disciplined legions and military organization. However, when invading Lusitania, the Romans underestimated the complexity of the terrain and the adaptability of the Lusitanians. Realizing that an open war would lead to certain defeat, Viriato adopted a radically different approach. He gathered warriors who knew the mountains and forests like no one else, forming an elite force specialized in quick and precise ambushes. What Rome saw as chaos, Viriato saw as a survival tactic. He not only led his men in battle, but also inspired a sense of unity and resistance. Viriato's prestige came not just from his skill with a sword, but from his charismatic leadership and understanding of the needs of the Lusitanian people. He offered something that Rome could not buy: the hope of freedom in a land threatened by colonization. The resistance grew stronger as more and more tribes joined his cause, captivated by Viriato's ability to defeat Roman legions in clashes that the Romans considered impossible to lose. Unlike Roman leaders who relied on rigid hierarchical structures, Viriato promoted strategic flexibility. His warriors moved quickly and attacked unpredictably, dismantling the rigid Roman formations. His greatest advantage was his intimate knowledge of the territory and the ability to adapt his tactics according to the circumstances. Without the need for extensive supply lines like the Roman legions, the Lusitanians hid in the shadows of the mountains, striking and disappearing before the Romans could react. Over time, the legend of Viriato grew beyond the borders of Lusitania. He would become a symbol of a resistance that, for a long time, seemed impossible. His emergence marked the beginning of a new form of combat, where cunning and knowledge of the terrain surpassed brute force. The lessons that Rome would learn against Viriato would not only shape future campaigns, but also reveal the vulnerabilities of an empire that, until then, seemed unbeatable. The rugged terrain of Lusitania, composed of steep mountains and dense forests, was Viriato's greatest ally. Unlike the open plains where the Romans excelled, the irregular environment made it difficult for the famous Roman formations, like the tortoise and the cohesion of the legions, to operate. Viriato knew that the Romans were invincible in terrains that favored their organization, but in the mountains, the Lusitanians had the upper hand. They moved quickly, appearing and disappearing like ghosts. The terrain was not just a natural obstacle, but an extension of the Lusitanian army. The Roman legions, accustomed to marching on flat ground and carefully paved roads, faced severe difficulties in maintaining their ranks intact in the mountains and forests. Viriato exploited these challenges, leading his men in swift ambushes in narrow ravines, where the Romans' numbers meant nothing. The Lusitanians attacked with rapid and unexpected ferocity, using the elevated terrain to launch surprise attacks and then disappearing safely. This strategy of constant mobility allowed Viriato to wear down the enemy without engaging in prolonged battles, where the Romans could leverage their numerical and disciplinary superiority. Instead, he imposed a war of attrition, where every Roman advance was thwarted by ambushes, every victory overshadowed by heavy losses, and the morale of the Roman troops began to waver. The effectiveness of Viriato's guerrilla tactics lay precisely in the speed of his movements and his men's ability to disperse into the terrain after each attack. Furthermore, Viriato utilized his geographical knowledge to his advantage, knowing exactly where to hide his men and where to set up ambushes. He studied the movements of the Roman troops and anticipated their weak points, exploiting ravines and narrow passages where the Romans could not maintain their formations. Every mountain and every valley was a potential trap. Viriato and his warriors blended into the environment, becoming almost invisible while waiting for the perfect moment to strike. This strategy of adapting to the terrain was one of the reasons why Rome, despite its immense strength, struggled so much to subjugate the Lusitanians. The terrain, which was a logistical nightmare for the Romans, became a natural extension of Viriato's combat strength. The combination of inhospitable terrain and rapid mobility transformed the Lusitanian army into a formidable threat that could not be defeated by the traditional tactics of the Roman legions. Viriato transformed rapid attacks into his main combat tactic, now known as guerrilla. He understood that if he attempted a conventional war, the Roman legions, with their discipline and numerical superiority, would prevail. Thus, the element of surprise became a deadly weapon. His warriors moved in small groups, hitting the Roman flanks when they least expected it, cutting their supply lines, and eliminating isolated detachments. Each attack was a precise strike, designed to weaken the morale and structure of the legions. Viriato's attacks were swift and devastating. During the night or in moments of low visibility, his men would appear out of nowhere, striking and retreating before the Romans could react. The psychological impact of this tactic was devastating for the Roman soldiers who, even in large numbers, never knew when they would be hit. With their mobility and knowledge of the terrain, the Lusitanians made the Romans easy targets, incapable of mounting an effective defense. Each battle didn't last long, but it left the Romans increasingly exhausted and demoralized. In addition to the element of surprise, Viriato employed decoy tactics to lure the Romans into carefully planned traps. He sent small groups to provoke the Romans and lead them to locations where his larger forces would gain the upper hand. When the Romans advanced in pursuit, Viriato already had his troops positioned to ambush, attacking from multiple sides and retreating before the enemy could react. This psychological warfare caused the Romans, once confident in their invulnerability, to become paranoid and insecure. These rapid and precise attacks dismantled the organizational capacity of the legions. The Roman legions relied on discipline, formation, and clear communication to operate effectively, but Viriato sabotaged these traits by destabilizing the Romans before they could even prepare. Roman formations, like the cohesive tortoise, testudo, became useless against the mobility of the Lusitanians. The speed of attack and withdrawal was such that the Romans barely had time to form adequate lines. Viriato's success with lightning strikes revealed an intrinsic weakness in the Roman legions: their dependence on an inflexible structure. While the Romans were slow to react, the Lusitanians, under Viriato's command, became masters of quick warfare. Viriato not only adapted his tactics to the terrain, but also revolutionized the way the Romans viewed war, challenging their notions of strength and order with controlled and surprising chaos. Viriato's war was not just physical, but also psychological. He understood that weakening the enemy's morale was just as important as winning battles. The Romans, accustomed to triumphal marches and quick victories, found in Viriato an adversary who denied them that. Each ambush, each unexpected attack eroded the confidence of the troops, and the idea that they could be attacked at any moment began to generate fear and disorder. The legions, which once advanced with the certainty of victory, began to fear the very terrain they marched upon. Viriato created an atmosphere of constant uncertainty. His attacks did not follow a predictable pattern, which kept the Romans in a state of perpetual alertness. Over time, this drained the soldiers, both mentally and physically. Feeling vulnerable at every step, the Roman legionaries began to lose cohesion. Distrust among the troops grew as the Lusitanians seemed to be everywhere and at the same time nowhere. The fear of constant ambushes turned each Roman advance into a terrifying experience. This psychological tension was one of Viriato's greatest weapons. He knew that by repeatedly frustrating the Romans, they could fall into despair or make rash decisions. By demoralizing his opponents, he bought time and increased his chances of victory. Rome, an empire built on the certainty of absolute power, now faced doubt. Even in battles where the Romans believed they had achieved a small victory, the wear and tear caused by psychological losses accumulated, undermining their overall effectiveness. Over time, this psychological warfare began to affect the Roman commanders as well. The generals, who once led with confidence, started to doubt their strategies as nothing seemed to work against Viriato. Each new plan failed when put into practice, and the successive failures began to reverberate in Rome. The Senate demanded victories, but the Roman army was caught in a cycle of invisible attacks and slow defeats. The psychological weariness reached a point where Rome began to consider negotiations and alliances, something unthinkable for an empire that rarely bowed down. The effect of Viriato on Roman morale was so profound that he didn't need to defeat all the legions to triumph. Just the fact that he made Rome doubt its own power was a victory in itself. Viriato demonstrated that war was not won solely on the battlefield, but also in the enemy's mind. By undermining the confidence and security of the Romans, he proved that a united people, with a shrewd leader who understood the terrain, could challenge the greatest empire of the time.